The wind howled outside the grand ballroom of the Berkshire resort, but inside the air was suffocating under the weight of hundreds of stairs. Clara Whitmore stood at the head of the aisle, her shimmering white silk wedding gown catching the chandelier's glow like a lighthouse of surrender. Her hands trembled as she gripped the lily bouquet so tightly the stems bent. The organist stopped playing, the final notes hanging in the air, and murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. "Clara," her mother whispered from the front row, her voice sharp as a velvet-wrapped blade, "go!" But Clara couldn't move. Not when she saw James, her fiancé of 3 years, the man she had loved so deeply, standing at the altar, pale-faced, eyes cast to the floor. He wouldn't look at her. He hadn't looked at her all morning. And then, as if the universe had conspired to crush her in the most public way possible, James stepped forward and raised his hand to silence the room. "I can't do this," he said, his voice low but echoing across every corner. "I'm sorry, Clara. I can't marry you. I'm in love with someone else." The words struck like gunfire. Gasps echoed. Clara's bouquet slipped from her hands, white petals scattering across the marble floor. Her mother stood abruptly, face frozen in horror. James's parents began whispering furiously, but Clara heard none of it. The world shrank to the pounding of her own heart and the heat rising in her face. She turned, her veil catching on a chair, and she ran. The double doors of the ballroom burst open as she fled, the December air biting her bare shoulders. Snow swirled, clinging to her gown, her heels sinking into fresh powder. She didn't care. She didn't stop. The manicured resort grounds blurred around her, trimmed hedges, twinkling lights, the distant sound of violins now silent. She ran until the lights faded, until the voices were swallowed by the wind, and all that remained was the sound of her own ragged breath. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of pines and darkness. Clara plunged into it, her wedding dress snagging on branches, her shoes slipping on ice-slick roots. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. That was all that mattered, away from humiliation, from pity, from betrayal. James's words echoed in her head, each syllable a fresh wound. "I can't marry you." Why? She had asked herself 100 times in the past hour, but the answer was only silence. The snow thickened, fat flakes falling relentlessly. Clara's fingers went numb, her lips trembled as she pushed deeper into the woods. Her veil was gone, yanked away by a low branch. The once pristine dress was streaked with mud and pine needles. She tripped, her ankle twisting, and she fell to her knees in the snow. For a moment she thought about staying there, letting the cold take her, letting the forest bury her shame. But then, through the blizzard haze, she saw it. A light, faint and flickering, like a candle in a storm. It glowed from the far side of the hill, hidden deep within the woods. Clara pushed herself up, breath puffing out in clouds. She didn't know what it was, a house, a cabin, or a mirage. But it was something. Shelter, safety, a place to hide. The journey to the light felt endless. Her gown dragged behind her, heavy with snow. Her fingers throbbed as she clung to tree trunks for balance. When she finally crested the hill, she stopped, her breath catching. Before her stood a mansion, its stone facade half covered in ivy, its tall windows dark, except for one, faintly glowing. The place looked ancient, as if it had grown out of the forest itself, its spires piercing the sky. The wrought iron gate hung open, creaking in the wind. Clara hesitated. The mansion was beautiful, but haunting, its stillness louder than the storm. She looked back at the forest, but the darkness gave her no other choice. Her body was near collapse, her teeth chattering, her limbs shaking. There was no other option. She staggered through the gate, her shoes crunching on gravel. The front door loomed large, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the dim light. She raised a trembling hand and knocked. The sound echoed, swallowed by the vastness inside. No answer. She knocked again, harder, her knuckles aching. Still nothing. "Please," she whispered, barely audible. She leaned against the door, her strength fading. Her eyelids grew heavy, the world tipping sideways. She slid down, her gown pooling around her like a fallen cloud. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the door creaking open, and a shadowy figure standing above her. Clara awoke to a comforting warmth, a foreign feeling after the biting cold of the forest. Her eyelids felt heavy, but the scent of burning wood and the soft orange glow of a fireplace pulled her from the fog of unconsciousness. She lay in a large bed, wrapped in a wool blanket up to her chin, her body aching as if it had been broken and reassembled. Her wedding dress, now filthy and torn, had been replaced by a gray sweater and soft pants that clearly weren't hers. Someone had changed her clothes. The thought jolted her upright, her heart pounding. The room was spacious, with faded paint on stone walls and a ceiling etched with ancient patterns. A worn Persian rug covered the wooden floor, its corners fraying. Outside the window, snow was still falling thick and fast, cloaking everything in a never-ending sheet of white. Clara touched her forehead, trying to piece together what had happened. The forest, the door, a shadow, then darkness. The bedroom door creaked and she stiffened. A man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, his steps measured as if each one was considered. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing solid, muscular forearms. His dark brown hair was tousled, and his eyes, gray, like a stormy sky, swept over her, cool but not hostile. He set a wooden tray on the bedside table, carrying a steaming cup of tea and a plate of toast. "You're awake," he said, voice low and dry, stripped of emotion. "I found you unconscious at the door. If I hadn't dragged you in, you'd be an ice sculpture by now." Clara swallowed, her throat raw. "Thank you," she croaked. I'm Clara. Clara Whitmore." He gave a slight nod as if her name held no significance. "David Hale," he said after a pause, then turned toward the fireplace to toss in more wood. The flames flared, illuminating his face. Sharp features, yet eyes that held a deep, unreachable sorrow, as if light itself refused to touch them. Clara clutched the blanket tighter, searching for words. "Where am I? I mean, this house." "Ravenwood Manor," David replied, still not looking at her. "My home. I live here, alone." The last part was spoken with finality, as if to raise a barrier too high to scale. Clara felt it, but she was too drained to care. She glanced at the cup of tea, steam clouding her vision. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said. "I was just lost. I'll leave as soon as I can." David stood upright, his shadow stretching across the floor. "You'll leave when the snow melts," he said, his voice as cold as the wind outside. "This storm will last at least a few days. The roads to town are blocked. No one's coming in, and you're not getting out." His words landed like a sentence. Clara felt her heart sink, not from being trapped, but from the way he said it. Like her presence was an inconvenience he had no choice but to bear. She wanted to ask why he lived alone in such a vast and isolated place, but his eyes, sharp and distant, kept her silent. He gestured toward the tray. "Eat. You need the strength. I don't want to be digging graves in the garden." The words were blunt, but there was a flicker of dark humor beneath them that left Clara unsure whether he was joking. She picked up the tea, warmth seeping into her fingers. "Who changed my clothes?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "I did," David replied without pause. Seeing the flush rise to her cheeks, he added, "You were hypothermic. Leaving you in that wet dress would have killed you. I didn't look, if that's what you're worried about." Clara nodded, her face burning. She sipped the tea, bitter black with a trace of honey. Silence settled over the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. She glanced at David, now standing by the window, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the snowfall. There was something about him, not just the coldness, but a quiet pain, as if he carried a shattered world inside him. "What were you running from?" he asked suddenly, still not turning around. Clara flinched, nearly spilling her tea. "How do you know I was running?" David shrugged. "No one wears a wedding dress into a snowstorm just to take in the view." She let out a short, hollow laugh, but it faded as the memory surged. James, his avoiding eyes, the words that cut like blades. "I was left at the altar," she whispered, "right before the ceremony. I couldn't stand the looks, so I ran." David said nothing for a long moment, then nodded, as if it was what he had expected. Weddings, he muttered, his tone tinged with bitterness. Expensive invitations to heartbreak. Clara wanted to argue, but she didn't have the energy. She stared down at her tea, tears threatening. I just want to forget it ever happened. Forget everything. David finally turned to look at her. His gaze was no longer cold. It was deep, as if he understood her pain more than she could imagine. Forgetting isn't that easy, he said quietly, but here at least you can hide for a while. The words were simple, but held an unexpected sincerity. Clara gave a faint smile, but David had already turned away, heading for the door. Rest, he said before leaving the room. You're safe here, for now. The door closed softly, leaving Clara with her cooling tea and a strange feeling settling over her. David Hale was a stranger, cold, guarded, mysterious. But in his eyes she had seen a wound not so different from her own. And though they had only just met, she knew this house and this man were hiding far more than met the eye. The silver light of morning filtered through the falling snow, slipping into the room where Clara lay. She awoke with a heaviness in her chest, as if sleep had been less a rest than a silent war. The sweater David had given her still carried the scent of pine wood and smoke, small comforts in an otherwise unfamiliar place. She sat up and looked around. Everything in the room was strangely beautiful, from the frayed Persian rug to the dust-covered chandelier hanging limply from the ceiling. But something felt off. The house, despite its grandeur, was unnervingly still, as if it were holding its breath. Clara stood, her bare feet meeting the icy stone floor. She opened the door and stepped into a dim hallway, where only a few wall sconces flickered weakly. Portraits lined the walls, aged faces with eyes that seemed to follow her, and she shivered. She moved carefully, fingers brushing along the carved wooden railing, each footstep echoing in the cavernous space. Ravenwood Manor was as majestic as a forgotten palace, but it lacked life. There was no warmth, no pulse, only the moan of wind and the steady fall of snow. She descended to the sitting room, where the fire still burned, though weakly, the flames sputtering as if they too were growing weary. David was nowhere in sight. A tray sat on the table, bread, cheese, and a pot of now cold tea. Clara took a few bites, not out of hunger, but to shake off the growing unease inside her. She looked out the window. Snow continued to fall, erasing all paths. She was trapped here, with a man she barely knew, whose name and haunted eyes were all she had. The night before, she had heard strange sounds. At first, she'd thought it was the wind, but then she realized they weren't. Footsteps, slow and heavy, as if someone was pacing the hall. Then the soft thud of a door closing, distant but real. She had lain still, heart pounding, telling herself it was just an old house groaning. But in the pale morning light, she couldn't shake the feeling that this house was alive, or trying to be. Clara decided to explore. She wandered from room to room, each one frozen in time. A library with shelves of books buried in dust, pages yellowed with age. A dining room with a table long enough for 20, but only one chair pulled out, as if only one person had ever sat there. Everything was beautiful, but cold, as though the entire estate was a museum for things that had died. She stopped before a set of heavy oak double doors, carved with roses and vines. She pushed them open, and a chill rushed out. Inside was a ballroom, with a soaring ceiling and faded frescoes. A lone piano stood in the corner, its ivory keys dulled by time. Clara approached and pressed one key softly. A low note reverberated, echoing through the emptiness, startling her. She quickly closed the lid, feeling as though she had trespassed. "You shouldn't touch what isn't yours," David's voice came from the doorway. Clara turned, heart jumping. He stood there, arms crossed, eyes cool but not angry. He wore a black sweater, hair tousled as though untouched by a comb. There was something about him, a presence, powerful yet drained, like a wounded animal that no longer fought. "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly. "I was just curious. This house is unusual." "Unusual," David echoed, his tone tinged with sarcasm. Is that what you call a place that's rotting from the inside out? Clara frowned, unsure how to respond. She glanced around, then asked, "Why do you live here alone?" "I mean, it's so big and so lonely." David stepped further into the room, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. He stopped near the piano, hand brushing the lid but not lifting it. "I don't live," he said, voice so low it was nearly a whisper. "I wait for the past to decay." The words sent a chill down her spine. She looked at him, searching for a sign that he was joking, but his eyes held only painful honesty. "What past?" she asked, even though she knew she was stepping into dangerous territory. David didn't answer right away. He turned to look out the window, where snow continued to fall without pause. "You don't need to know," he said. "You just need to stay here until the storm ends. Then go. Don't dig into things that don't belong to you." Clara wanted to object, to say she didn't mean to intrude, but something in his voice, the weariness, the buried hurt, made her fall silent. She changed the subject, pointing to the piano. "Who used to play this? It's beautiful, but sad." David turned back and his gaze darkened. "No one plays it anymore," he said sharply, "and it'll stay that way." He walked out, leaving Clara alone in the cold ballroom, curiosity and fear mixing in her chest. She stood there listening to the echo of his retreating footsteps. But then, just as she turned to leave, another sound caught her ear. A faint hiss like a window creaking in the wind, but it came from the hallway. She froze, staring toward the door. No one was there, only darkness. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Though the room was warm, every little sound, the creak of wood, the howl of wind, the imagined footsteps, made her startle. This house doesn't breathe, she thought, but it whispers, and she feared that whatever secrets it held wouldn't let her go so easily. Clara awoke to a cold, gray light. The storm still raged beyond the windows, as if the world outside Ravenwood Manor had been erased. 3 days had passed, and with each one, the house revealed more of its eerie nature. Endless corridors, locked doors, and strange noises echoing in the night. But this morning, Clara refused to let fear imprison her. She needed something to occupy her mind, to keep it from drifting back to James, to the shattered wedding, to the pitying stares that haunted her even now. She left her room, padding down the dim hallway, her bare feet brushing against the icy stone floor. She didn't call for David, though she knew he could be somewhere in this maze of stone. He appeared like a phantom, silent, distant, and vanished just as quickly, as if her presence was a burden he couldn't carry. Clara didn't blame him. She was running from herself, too. A slightly ajar door at the end of the hall caught her attention. Made of glossy walnut and carved with swirling musical notes, it stood out from the cold, plain doors throughout the manor. She pushed it open and stepped inside, a room smaller than the ballroom but warmer, with dark ebony walls and a fireplace still holding faint embers. In the center stood a grand antique piano, its ivory keys glowing under the muted light from the window, but it was the large portrait on the wall that stole Clara's breath. She approached slowly, breath-catching. The painting depicted a red-haired woman, her hair cascading like fire. She sat at the piano, fingers poised above the keys, her gaze soft yet piercing, as though she could see through time. Her beauty wasn't boastful. It was elegant, radiant with life. Clara couldn't look away. There was sorrow in her eyes, but also a quiet strength that resonated deeply. Clara reached out to the piano, fingertips brushing the smooth ivory. She hadn't played since she left home to be with James, but suddenly the memory of afternoons at her grandmother's upright piano came rushing back. She sat down, took a deep breath, and let her fingers find their way into Debussy's Clair de Lune. The notes floated into the air, gentle, liquid, like moonlight soothing her wounds. She closed her eyes, letting the music carry her, as if it could erase the storm, the pain, and the haunted house that surrounded her. She didn't realize David had entered until the final notes were near. A single off-key stroke marked her surprise as she opened her eyes to find him standing in the doorway, frozen, his face pale, as though he had seen a ghost. His eyes were locked not on her, but on the piano, on the portrait behind her. A chill ran through Clara's spine. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, rising to her feet, hands trembling. "I didn't mean to. I just found the room and—" "Don't apologize," David cut in, his voice hoarse, as if speaking cost him something. He stepped into the room slowly, each movement weighed down by an invisible burden. He stopped before the portrait, his fists clenched at his sides. "You play, just like her." Clara hesitated, unsure of what to say. She glanced at the painting, then at him. "Who was she?" she asked, though part of her already knew. David was silent, wrestling with something inside. At last he spoke, his voice low, nearly a whisper. "Evelyn, my wife." Clara felt her chest tighten. It didn't surprise her, but the word wife still struck like a blade. She looked at the portrait again. Evelyn's eyes seemed to follow her, and guilt rose within Clara, for having touched something that wasn't hers. She passed away, didn't she?" Clara asked softly. David nodded, his eyes still fixed on the painting. 4 years ago, in this very house." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "It was a crime, never solved." Clara froze. The sounds she'd heard at night, footsteps, closing doors, suddenly seemed more sinister. "What happened?" she asked, afraid of the answer. David turned, his expression no longer cold, but filled with anguish like a wound ripped open. "I don't know the whole truth," he said. "All I know is that she called me that night. I was in New York, busy with a deal. I didn't answer. When I called back, it was too late." He paused again, voice cracking. "I was too buried in work to be there when she needed me most." Tears welled in Clara's eyes. Not for Evelyn, whom she had never met, but for the pain in David's voice. She wanted to say something comforting, but no words felt worthy. She simply stood there quietly, letting him go on. "When I came home, she was gone," David said flatly, as if he'd recited the story countless times in his head. "The police said there were no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, just blood and her." He turned away, leaning against the piano, shoulders trembling. "I searched for answers, but there were none. Just questions. Just silence." Clara stepped closer, gently placing her hand on his arm. He didn't pull away, but he didn't respond either. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't imagine what you've been through." David shook his head, letting out a dry, bitter laugh. "Don't be. I don't deserve your sympathy." He looked at her, for the first time since entering the room, and his eyes sent a shiver through her. Not because of anger, but because of how hollow they were. "You should rest. Don't wander. This house, it doesn't like strangers." He walked out, leaving Clara alone with the silent piano and Evelyn's watchful portrait. She stared at the red-haired woman, feeling as though Evelyn was trying to tell her something, but she couldn't hear it. Only the ghost of Claire de Lune remained, echoing in Clara's chest, melancholy, haunting, and as sorrowful as the house itself. The storm outside Ravenwood Manor had eased, but the air in the sitting room remained heavy, as if the house itself cradled a grief too deep to speak aloud. Clara sat near the fireplace, the flickering flames casting shadows across her face. She cupped the tea David had brought her, the heat warming her fingers, though it could not reach the chill within. After that morning in the music room, after seeing Evelyn's portrait and hearing the story of her death, Clara felt as if a hidden door had been cracked open. David was no longer as distant, but he remained a mystery, a man trapped in the past, and she longed to understand why. David sat across from her in a worn armchair, his eyes fixed on the fire. He said nothing, but the icy barrier he had kept up at the beginning had thawed into a quiet sorrow. Clara didn't press him. She knew he would speak when he was ready. At last his voice emerged, low as if it came from some dark, buried place. "You asked about Evelyn," he said, still not looking at her. "She wasn't like anyone I'd ever met. An artist, gentle but fierce. She painted, played music, and loved this house despite its coldness. She had this way of making everything come alive. Even me, a man who only knew how to chase money and power." Clara smiled faintly, imagining the red-haired woman from the portrait. She sounds extraordinary. David nodded. A rare smile ghosted across his face, but vanished just as quickly. She was everything I wasn't. I built my company from nothing, chased contracts, numbers, handshakes. I thought I was doing the right thing. For her, for our future, but I was wrong. Clara tilted her head, sensing the weight behind his words. What happened? David inhaled deeply, as though gathering strength. 4 years ago, I expanded the company into Europe. It was a brutal market, but I wasn't afraid. I signed a massive deal with Blackthorn Capital, a powerful investment firm. They promised astronomical returns, and I saw it as a way to take my company to the next level. But I didn't realize what I was walking into. Clara frowned. What do you mean? David gave a dry, brittle laugh. Blackthorn wasn't just a financial firm. They were involved in shady operations. Money laundering, I later found out. One night while reviewing some documents, I noticed discrepancies. Large wire transfers from unknown sources, funneled through offshore accounts. I asked questions, thought it was a clerical error. They told me not to worry, but their eyes, like I'd touched a secret I wasn't meant to uncover. Clara's hands trembled around the cup. What did you do? I kept digging, David said, his voice dropping. Not because I was brave, I just wanted to protect my company, but I went too far. One night I received an anonymous email, internal documents from Blackthorn, proof they were using my company as a front. Before I could act, the warning started. Anonymous letters, late-night phone calls, only breathing on the other end. One time the brakes on my car were cut. I caught it just in time. Clara gasped, hand covering her mouth. They were trying to silence you. David nodded, his grip tightening on the armrest until his knuckles turned white. I thought I could handle it. I was used to dirty games in business, but I didn't expect them to go after Evelyn. He paused, shoulders trembling, as though the memory tore something raw inside him. Clara's heart ached. She wanted to speak, to offer comfort, but her throat closed. She simply waited. That night, David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I was in New York at a contract signing gala. Evelyn was here, alone. She called me, left a message. Her voice was shaky but calm. She said she heard noises outside, like someone was watching. I didn't answer. I was too busy raising a glass with men I thought were partners. He bowed his head, voice cracking. When I called back, no one picked up. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but she held them back. And what happened next? David looked up, his eyes empty, staring into nothing. The police found her the next morning, in the music room. No sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no tampered locks. Nothing stolen, just blood and her. He paused, breath hitching. One stab wound, precise, clean, like the person knew exactly what they were doing. Clara's whole body tensed. How could that even happen? David turned to her, eyes like blades. The police suspected me. I was the husband, and I wasn't there. The media pounced, called me a monster. Businessman leaves wife to die. Cold-blooded tycoon. My career was over. Contracts dropped. Partners vanished. But I didn't care about any of that. I just wanted to know who did it and why. Clara leaned forward, voice trembling. Did you find out? I know it was Blackthorn, David said, voice like ice. They wanted to send a message that no one digs into their secrets. Evelyn was their way of getting to me. Not to kill me, but to shut me up. But I had no proof. No witnesses, no cameras, nothing. Just that anonymous email, and it vanished the moment I tried to send it to my lawyer. He let out a bitter laugh. I didn't get back in time to save her. That's something I'll never forgive myself for. Silence settled, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Clara felt a strange ache. Not just for Evelyn, but for David, a man still breathing but barely living. She wanted to touch him, to tell him he didn't have to carry the guilt alone, but words would never be enough. You're still here, she said gently, in this house. Why? David stared into the fire, its red glow reflected in his eyes. Because she loved it here, and because I don't know where else to go. Leaving would mean accepting that she died for nothing. I can't do that." Clara nodded, her chest heavy. She looked at him and saw a man frozen not by winter, but by loss. And in that moment, she understood. Though their pain came from different places, she and David were the same. Two people running from ghosts and from themselves. Pale noon light filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows down the cold stone corridor of Ravenwood Manor. Clara moved quietly, the soft soles of her shoes echoing faintly in the silence. Though the storm had eased, snow still piled high at the gates, trapping her and David within this house of secrets. After last night's revelation about Evelyn, about Blackthorn Capital, about the laundering operation David had stumbled upon, Clara couldn't sit still. She needed to know more, not just about David, but about the house itself, which seemed to hold its ghosts with a jealous grip. She'd noticed that David often disappeared into a room upstairs, a room he would enter for hours each day. The heavy oak door was always shut tight, locked with an old brass latch. Sometimes she heard faint clinks and clicks from behind it, as if he were opening a safe or sifting through old files. Today, with David outside inspecting frozen water lines, Clara made a decision. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs. The upstairs corridor was dim, lit only by the flicker of a single oil lamp on the wall. She approached the locked door, its cold handle sending a jolt through her fingers. She had no intention of breaking in. She wasn't foolish, but something caught her eye. A yellowed slip of paper jutting out from beneath the door, as if caught there by accident. She crouched and gently pulled it free. It was an old envelope sealed shut with a handwritten title that made her blood go cold. Investigation Report. Evelyn Hale Case. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. She glanced around, no one in sight, then slipped the envelope into her sweater pocket. She moved on, walking carefully down the corridor, until she found another door slightly ajar. Inside was a small library, the shelves dusty and sagging under the weight of untouched books. In the corner, a wooden box lay open atop a writing desk, filled with documents, contracts, letters, and typewritten pages yellowed by time. Clara stepped closer, hands trembling as she flipped through them. Several of the contracts were stamped in red. Canceled. No reason given. Blackthorn Capital appeared repeatedly. Scribbled notes in David's handwriting read, "Check offshore accounts, contact FBI. Danger." One internal report detailed the very transactions David had mentioned. Questionable wire transfers, mysterious investors, foreign banks. One note chilled her to the bone. "Blackthorn is tied to an international criminal network. If they know I have evidence, I'm not the only target." David hadn't just been a victim. He had fought back, against something far more powerful than himself. Heavy footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Clara's heart leapt. She shoved the papers back into the box, slipped from the room, and pulled the door closed just as David appeared, snow clinging to his coat, weariness on his face. His eyes narrowed when he saw her. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, his voice sharp. Clara swallowed hard, keeping her tone calm. "Just exploring. This place is massive. I was curious." David's gaze lingered as if trying to read her thoughts, but he didn't press. "Don't go where you're not allowed," he said. His voice was cold but not cruel. He moved past her, pulling a key from his coat and unlocking the heavy door. Before disappearing inside, he paused. "If you want to know something, ask. Don't dig where you shouldn't." Clara's hand clenched around the envelope in her pocket, guilt and determination warring within her. She followed, hovering at the threshold. Inside was a study, papers scattered across a wide desk, books stacked high, and a framed photo of Evelyn smiling beside the piano. Clara drew in a breath and summoned her courage. "I found this," she said, holding out the envelope. "The investigation report. About Evelyn." David froze. His eyes darkened as he stepped forward and snatched it from her hand, though he didn't open it. "You had no right," he said, voice trembling. Not just with anger, but pain. Clara wasn't sure which. I'm sorry," she said sincerely, "but I saw the documents in the library, the canceled contracts, your notes. You tried to expose Blackthorn, didn't you?" You did more than just survive. David stared at her, something flickering behind his eyes. At last he exhaled and sank into a chair, rubbing his forehead with one hand. I tried, he said hoarsely. After I uncovered the laundering scheme, I contacted an old friend at the FBI. I sent them copies, emails, reports, internal memos. They said they needed more. Something solid. I thought I could beat Blackthorn. I thought I could bring them down, but I underestimated them. Clara sat across from him, her heart pounding. What happened? David's gaze drifted to Evelyn's photograph. His voice fell to a near whisper. Blackthorn knew. Either they had someone in the government or they were watching me. They sent a message. Evelyn. She was that message. They didn't kill her to hurt me. They killed her to shut me up. And they did it perfectly. No evidence, no witnesses, nothing but blood and a mystery no one could solve. Clara's breath caught. She couldn't fathom that kind of loss. Loving someone, only to have them stolen as a consequence of your own courage. How do you live with that? She asked, her voice cracking. With the memories, day after day, in the very house where it happened? David looked up, his eyes haunted but resolute. I don't leave because leaving means accepting that she died for nothing. I stay because this house was her sanctuary, and because part of me still hopes, foolishly, that one day I'll find something. Something that will let her rest. Tears slipped silently down Clara's cheek. She didn't speak. Words were useless against pain that deep. She simply looked at him, a man imprisoned not just by these walls, but by his own guilt and undying love. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'll never fully understand, but if you ever need someone, I'm here. David looked at her, and for the first time, his gaze softened, as if her words had reached a part of him no one else had touched in years. You don't need to do anything, he murmured. Just survive the storm, then leave. That's the best thing you can do. He stood and turned away, but Clara knew the door between them, however slightly, had opened. She looked into the once locked room, now filled with broken truths and fading hope, and wondered if she could help David find the light again, or if both of them would remain lost in the shadows of Ravenwood forever. The fire in Ravenwood Manor's sitting room blazed bright, its amber glow dancing across the stone walls, softening the chill that clung to the house like an echo of grief. Clara sat on a worn Persian rug, her legs curled up, a glass of red wine in hand, one David had brought up from the cellar. The wine was bold and warm on her tongue, but it did little to melt the heaviness in her chest. Tonight, after what she'd discovered behind the locked door, investigation files, canceled contracts, and David's silent anguish, she felt closer to him, and yet further away. He was a man trapped, and she didn't know if she could pull him out of the dark. David sat across from her in his usual armchair, wine barely touched, eyes fixed on the flames. He seemed to be listening to a story only he could hear, one the fire whispered in a language made of ash and memory. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but fragile, an unspoken pact to let everything rest for a while, just to breathe. Clara sipped her wine, the dry finish tingling on her lips. She glanced at David, the firelight sculpting his face, the high bridge of his nose, the sharp cut of his jaw, the storm-gray eyes that still carried too many ghosts. He wasn't the cold man she'd first met, but the wall around him hadn't fallen. It stood, built of guilt and loss, and she longed to press against it, just to find the man beneath. Have you ever thought about starting over? She asked gently, voice soft so as not to disturb the delicate stillness between them. Not leaving, but living again. Somehow. David turned to her, his gaze locking with hers, deep, unreadable. Living again, he echoed, a trace of bitterness in his voice. You think I still know how? Clara offered a sad smile. I'm not sure I know either. But sometimes, all it takes is a single moment, something small, to remind you that you're still here. He didn't answer, but his gaze didn't leave her, and in that gaze something shifted. He no longer looked at her like a guest or a trespasser. He saw her as a woman, warm and alive. Clara felt it, the change, and her heartbeat quickened. She set down her glass and shifted closer, kneeling on the rug just to reach away. "David," she said softly, her voice trembling, "you don't have to carry it all tonight. Not alone." He tensed but didn't retreat. Clara reached for him, hesitated, then gently laid her hand over his, still wrapped around the untouched glass. His hand was warm, trembling beneath her fingers. She held it lightly, feeling the calluses on his skin, the texture of someone who had once worked, fought, lost. David stared at their hands, then slowly lifted his eyes to hers. "Clara," he murmured, her name breaking on his lips like a confession. He set his glass aside and raised his other hand to her cheek, brushing it as though afraid she'd vanish. Clara closed her eyes, breath caught. His touch wasn't just a touch. It was a reaching, a remembering, a connection forged in shared silence. They leaned in slowly, as if time itself had slowed to preserve this fragile moment. His lips touched hers, tentative, tender. The kiss wasn't rushed or claiming. It was deep, full of pain, full of the loneliness they both bore. She tasted the wine on him, the warmth of his breath, and for a heartbeat, everything else faded. James, the ruined wedding, the haunted manor. There was only David, and the sudden aching knowledge that she was alive. But then David pulled away, abruptly as if waking from a dream. He stood, turned his back, fists clenched. "I don't deserve this," he said, voice ragged. "Not you, not anyone." Clara remained where she was, breath shallow, her cheeks burning. She wanted to call him back, to tell him he was wrong, that he wasn't the monster he believed himself to be. But she saw the way his shoulders trembled, the way he held himself like a man at war with his own soul, and she knew words would be useless. "David," she whispered, voice breaking, "you don't have to deserve anything. Just allow yourself to feel. Just once." He turned to look at her, just for a moment. In his eyes was a torment so raw it stole her breath. "You don't understand," he said. "I let Evelyn die. I can't drag you down with me." And then he walked out, leaving Clara with the dying fire and a silence that roared in her chest. She sat there, her fingers brushing her lips where his warmth still lingered. That kiss wasn't the start of a love story. It was a crack in the armor he'd worn for too long. And she knew, even if he had pushed her away, he had let her touch something real, something still alive, buried deep. Clara made herself a quiet promise. If there was even a flicker left in David Hale, she would not let it be extinguished. Not by guilt, not by fear, not by the ghosts of Ravenwood. Are you still following the story? Please leave your thoughts on the story in the comments below. All your comments are the motivation for us to create better stories. Don't forget to subscribe to Soul Stories. Thank you very much. The snow had stopped by the 5th morning, leaving Ravenwood Manor cloaked in a glistening white coat, as if the world outside had been freshly rewritten. Clara stood by the sitting room window, staring out at the road leading to the gate. Finally cleared. The storm had passed, and with it, the excuse to stay. But as she looked back at the house, the cold stone walls, the shadowy halls, and David, the man who carried a winter no season could melt, she knew she wasn't ready to go. David stepped into the room, traces of melted snow clinging to his coat, a ring of car keys dangling from his fingers. He set them down on the table without meeting her eyes. "The car's ready," he said, voice flat, like reporting the weather. "The road to town's open. You can leave." Clara looked at the keys, then at him. He stood there, tall and still, but she saw the tightness in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched. Last night's kiss, slow, broken, intimate, lingered in her like a bruise, along with the words he'd spoken. "I don't deserve this." He wasn't pushing her away because he didn't want her to stay. He was pushing her away because he was afraid to let her come any closer. "I'm not leaving," Clara said, her voice steady. She stepped forward, positioning herself directly in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "Not today." David's brow furrowed, his expression darkening. "You don't have a reason to stay. You don't belong here." "Maybe not," she replied, her voice soft but unwavering. "But neither do you. Not in a place ruled by ghosts and guilt. I'm staying because I want to, David, and because I think you need someone, even if you won't admit it." He turned away from her, his fist clenching, her words striking something still raw. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low but sharp. "This isn't a home. It's a mausoleum. You should leave, before it pulls you under too." Clara didn't respond. Instead, she moved. She walked past him into the kitchen, retrieved a bucket of warm water and an old rag. She began to clean, not because the house demanded it, but because she wanted to break the silence that choked it. She flung open the curtains, letting daylight pour in, exposing the dust settled over years of stillness. She found a box of sandalwood incense and lit one, letting the earthy scent drift through the cold stone and aged wood. In the music room, she wiped down the piano, her fingers brushing the keys, but she didn't play. Not yet. David stood in the doorway watching her. His face was a storm of emotion, anger, confusion, and something close to fear. "What are you doing?" he demanded, voice tight. "Cleaning," Clara said calmly, continuing to wipe down a portrait on the wall. A woman in Victorian garb, likely one of David's ancestors. "This house is beautiful, but it's suffocating. It needs to breathe, David. And so do you." He strode over, grabbed the rag from her hand, and flung it to the floor. "You have no right," he snapped, his voice echoing through the room. "You don't have the right to make this your home. This isn't your place, Clara." She didn't flinch. She met his eyes, seeing not just fury, but pain, barely contained. "What about you?" she said, calm but piercing. "You think you have the right to bury yourself alive? You think Evelyn would have wanted you to live like this, in the shadow of your own guilt?" At her name, David froze, as if she'd struck him. He stepped back, trembling, his face tight with anguish. "Don't talk about her," he whispered, not in rage but in exhaustion. "You don't know what she would have wanted." "Maybe not," Clara said, stepping closer, her voice gentler now. "But I know she loved you, and I don't believe she would have wanted you to rot inside your grief. I'm not here to replace her, David. I just want to help you live again, even if it's only a little." She placed her hand on his arm, firm but soft. His eyes met hers, flickering with something, hope, maybe, or fear of it. He didn't pull away, but he didn't lean in either. Silence stretched between them, the fire crackling in the distance, incense curling like smoke around old wounds. At last he turned and walked away. "Do whatever you want," he muttered, voice rough, "but don't expect thanks." Clara stood still, watching him disappear down the hall. She knew he wasn't fighting her, he was fighting himself. She picked up the rag, resumed her work, not to make this her home, but to remind him that it still could be one, that he still could be more than a haunted man in a haunted house. She didn't know if she could tear down the walls he had built, but she would not leave, not until he saw the light, even if just once. Morning light streamed softly through the freshly drawn curtains in the music room, casting golden slants across the now dusted piano. Its ivory keys glimmered like an invitation. Clara stood beside it, her fingers lightly tracing the polished wood of the lid. In the past few days, she had tried to breathe life into Ravenwood Manor, opening windows, burning incense, scrubbing away the layers of time. And though the house had begun to stir, David remained unchanged, a ghost drifting through its halls, silent and distant, as if the kiss they'd shared and the pain that followed had been nothing more than a fleeting dream. She didn't blame him. Wounds like David's didn't heal with time alone. But that morning she felt something strange, a pull, as though the house itself was whispering to her, urging her towards something unseen. She left the music room and climbed the stairs, her steps slow and cautious, to the master bedroom, one David never spoke of. He slept in a smaller room beside his office now, leaving this one behind like a shrine to Evelyn. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The room was spacious and still, with a four-poster bed draped in aged white silk. A vanity stood in the corner, its mirror clouded, reflecting her as little more than a shadow. Clara stepped closer, fingers brushing across dried perfume bottles and a tarnished silver brush. There was a weight in the air, as though the room was guarding a secret. Kneeling, she checked beneath the vanity and saw it, a white envelope, edges yellowed, wedged deep between the wood and the wall. Carefully, she pulled it free, her pulse quickening. The handwriting was elegant, written in black ink. To David, my love. Clara's hands trembled. It was Evelyn's handwriting. The envelope was sealed, untouched, forgotten, or maybe left behind on purpose. She stared at it, her heart torn. Opening it would be a violation, but leaving it buried felt like betrayal. In the end, she chose not to open it. The letter wasn't hers to read, but she would make sure David saw it. Clara returned to the music room and placed the envelope gently atop the piano, right in the center, impossible to miss. She left no note. The letter would speak for itself. Then she stepped away, keeping herself busy, trying not to think about what would come next. David appeared late in the afternoon, when the sun's dying light filled the music room with soft amber. Clara was dusting a bookshelf in the sitting room when she heard his footsteps, followed by a long silence. She knew he had seen it. She moved to the doorway quietly, standing in the shadow, watching. David stood before the piano, the envelope in his hands already opened. He read slowly, as if each word carved into him. Clara couldn't see the contents, but she saw his shoulders begin to shake, saw how tightly he clutched the letter, as though afraid it might disappear. And then he fell to his knees beside the piano, head bowed low, and the sound of his sobs, hoarse and broken, filled the silence of the room. Clara stepped forward, heart aching. She knelt beside him but didn't reach for him. She simply stayed, present. "David," she whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I found it under the vanity. I thought she wanted you to read it." David lifted his face, eyes red and wet, his features contorted with grief. But there was something else there too, a flicker of light breaking through the darkness. He held the letter out to her, his hand trembling. "Read it," he said, his voice barely audible. "I want you to know." Clara took it gently, her eyes scanning Evelyn's graceful script. "David, my love, if you're reading this, then I may already be gone. I don't know what's coming, but I feel a shadow growing near. I don't blame you, never. You gave me a life full of color, even if we didn't have enough time. But please don't punish yourself forever. Don't let this house, or your heart, become a tomb. Love again, if someone brave enough finds their way to your door. They'll need strength to reach you. But I believe you're still worthy. I'll always be here, in the music you love, in the light you once chased. Live, David, for me. With all my love, always, Evelyn." Tears slid silently down Clara's cheeks. The letter was not long, but every word carried a weight of love and aching hope. She looked at David, who had buried his face in his arms, weeping like a man who had lost everything. She set the letter down and placed a hand on his shoulder, soft but unwavering. "She loved you," Clara said gently, "and she wanted you to live." David didn't push her away. Instead, he reached for her hand and gripped it tightly, as if she were the only thing anchoring him to this world. "I never saw it," he whispered, voice cracking. 4 years, and I didn't know she'd left this for me." Clara gave him a tearful smile. "She knew you'd find it, when you were ready." They stayed there on the floor beside the piano, bathed in the last light of day, Evelyn's letter resting between them like a bridge from past to present. Clara didn't know if David could truly let go of his guilt, but she knew something had shifted, that he'd been changed. The letter wasn't just a farewell, it was a reminder that love, even lost, could still shine through the darkest corners. A year had passed since the storm that brought Clara Whitmore to Ravenwood Manor. Winter had returned to the Berkshires, snow falling gently, draping the pine forests in soft white silk. But Ravenwood was no longer the cold mausoleum it had once been. The stone walls had been restored, the windows now glowed with warm golden light, and laughter, though still rare, echoed through rooms once steeped in silence. The house had become a healing center, a place where survivors of grief learned to mend and rediscover meaning in their lives. Clara stood in the music room, now transformed into a vibrant art studio. Paintings lined the walls, her own and those of the residents, blending with Ravenwood's older portraits. Evelyn's portrait still hung at the center, her gaze soft and approving, as if blessing all the changes. Clara touched the piano, the same one that once held Evelyn's letter, and smiled. That letter hadn't just saved David, It had saved her, too. That morning, Clara held a copy of the local newspaper. The headline took her breath away. Blackthorn Capital collapses. Executives arrested for money laundering and organized crime. The article detailed how, after years of investigation, the FBI had finally dismantled the Blackthorn network using internal documents and anonymous sources. Clara knew where those documents had come from. David. From the days he'd risked everything to expose the truth, only to lose Evelyn as a brutal warning. She found David outside helping some of the residents decorate a small Christmas tree in the garden, lights twinkling beneath a dusting of snow. He was no longer the man frozen by that long-ago winter. The pain was still in his gray eyes, but it was tempered now by gentleness. He had learned how to live again, step by step, thanks to Clara, and to those they'd chosen to help. "David!" she called, holding up the newspaper, her voice trembling. "They got them! Blackthorn! All of them!" David froze, a silver ornament in his hand. He took the paper from her and scanned the headline, exhaling slowly. His breath curled white into the cold air. "So it's over," he murmured, voice low, disbelieving. "After all these years." Clara stepped closer, resting a hand on his. "Not over," she said softly, "but justice. For Evelyn. And for you." He looked at her, his eyes flickering between relief and sorrow. "I thought justice would make me feel whole," he confessed, "but it doesn't bring her back. It doesn't erase the years I locked myself away." Clara tightened her grip. "No, but it lets you let go. Evelyn wanted you to live, David, and you're doing that. Every day, with this place, with these people, with me." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close like she was the only anchor he had ever known. "You're right," he whispered into her hair. "You gave me a reason to live, Clara. I never thought I'd find that again." Their love had bloomed slowly, like a flower pushing through frost. It grew from quiet moments, nights by the fire, shared silences and wine, from Clara cleaning the house despite his rage, from the kiss layered in grief, and the letter that opened David to forgiveness. Their love didn't blaze, it endured. It illuminated their darkest days. Together they had turned Ravenwood into a sanctuary. Clara ran group therapy sessions where people shared their stories. David taught painting, helping others express what words couldn't. He laughed more now, opened up more, though he still bore the quiet weight of someone who had once lost everything. Clara loved him for that, for his silent resilience, for the way he looked at her like she was a light he never thought he'd see again. They stepped onto the balcony, snowflakes falling around them, settling on the garden they had brought back to life. The Christmas tree sparkled in the corner, a gift from the residents for the center's first winter. David wrapped his arm around Clara, his breath warm against her ear. "Do you ever regret not leaving this place?" he asked softly, seriously. Clara leaned into his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Not for a single second," she replied. "I didn't come here to run away, David. I came to stay." He lowered his head, kissed her, slow, deep, no longer hesitant. It was a promise. They would move forward together, carrying Evelyn's love not as a burden, but as a guiding light. Clara felt the healing in him, not because he'd forgotten Evelyn, but because he had learned to live fully for her and for himself. They stood together watching the snowfall, the lights from Ravenwood glowing into the forest beyond. The Blackthorn story was a chapter closed, but theirs was just beginning. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a haven. David tightened his grip on her hand, and Clara knew, no matter how cold the winters grew, they would always have each other to stay warm. In the spring, Ravenwood burst into bloom, sunlight bathing the wildflowers in gold. David led Clara to the same balcony where they had once watched snowfall. He knelt before her, holding a simple silver ring etched with a music note, a symbol of Evelyn and a promise for the future. "Clara," he said, his voice shaking, "you pulled me out of the dark. You are the light I never dared to dream of. Will you marry me?" Clara covered her mouth, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him into an embrace. Their kiss sealed it, beneath the spring sky, with Ravenwood as their witness. They married that summer in the garden of Ravenwood, now lush with greenery and flowers. It was a small ceremony, intimate. Clara's parents came. Her mother, once stern and distant, now embraced her with tears and whispered, "I'm sorry I tried to force you. You found your real happiness." Her father shook David's hand, pride shining in his eyes. "You gave my girl a home." Even James came, standing quietly at the back. Clara had invited him, not out of resentment, but to close the door gently. After the ceremony, she approached him. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for letting me go. It helped me find where I truly belong." James smiled, wistful. "I'm the one who should apologize, Clara. I didn't deserve you, but I'm glad you found someone who does." They shook hands, a small, meaningful act of peace. The garden was strung with lanterns and flowers. The music room's piano now played by one of the residents. Claire de Lune filled the air, the song that had once connected Clara and David in sorrow, now a melody of joy. They danced beneath the moonlight, Clara in a simple white silk dress, David in a gray suit. He whispered into her ear, "I love you, Clara, and I will love you every day." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the rhythm of his heart, knowing that Ravenwood was no longer just a house. It was home. It was healing. It was the heart of them both.